Welcome to the second meeting of Philosophy 201, Introduction to Logic. Today's discussion is going to be a little bit different than the typical, just because the typical discussion will be aimed, as I said last time, at preparing you to solve a problem set. Now, there will be a problem set that you can use, that you'll be assigned, and that you can use to reinforce the concepts from today. But the main focus today is on the motivation for doing symbolic logic. So although symbolic logic can have the same kind of fun and problem-solving satisfaction as, say, a course in abstract mathematics can, in fact, actually, we think that there's, in some sense, a deeper meaning to doing symbolic logic, and that it does inform the questions that come up for each and every one of us as we think about what it means to be a rational person, what it means to use our brains the best way we can to think things through straight. So today's discussion is going to be focused on explaining why, in order to meet that general human goal of being good thinkers, we would end up using symbolic logic. So the title is Why Symbolic Logic, naturally enough. Now, let me very quickly bring our focus in on something specific. In one way or another, the focus of everything in this course is on arguments. Now, I don't mean arguments when, as in the case where people bicker, where people are being unpleasant toward each other. I mean the kind of arguments that come up in every academic discipline, that come up on the editorial pages of a newspaper, arguments that in the better days come up in politics when people try to put forward a position and give evidence for that position. So in short, an argument happens anytime anyone tries to establish one claim, and we'll call that the conclusion of the argument, using other claims, which we'll call throughout this course the premises of the argument. So an argument consists of everything in an argument is a statement. Some of those statements are intended to support the conclusion, those are the premises. Some of those statements, or one of those statements, is the conclusion thing that's supposed to be supported. Now, I use the word statement as a somewhat technical term because, in fact, although everything in an argument is a sentence, not every sentence really can play a role in an argument. For example, a question can't really play a role in an argument. I can't support something else by asking you something. Similarly, a proposal can't serve as a premise or a conclusion in an argument. I can't say, let's go to the concert, and then supply evidence to support that conclusion because the conclusion itself was not a claim. Now, the claim may be something like, we should go to the concert, or we would do well to go to the concert, or you would be a happier person if you go to the concert, but just a proposal like, let's go to the concert can't be a premise or a conclusion in an argument. Okay, philosophers sometimes go even further than the word statement, and they use the phrase, the word proposition. So a proposition is a philosopher's technical word for a premise or a conclusion of an argument. So in short, it's a statement that can either be true or false. Now, in real life, in everyday life, so of course, in normal contexts, someone won't necessarily hand to you an argument packaged up nicely where they say, here's my conclusion, here's my premises. So for example, if you went and you read an op-ed in the New York Times, it may at first be a little bit unclear. What is the person's point? What's the conclusion they're making? We, of course, do have ways of signaling that in the English language. We say things like hence, or therefore, or for those reasons, we see that, ... and there comes the conclusion. So in the first problem set, I'll give you a little bit of practice just refreshing your ability to identify what the conclusion of an argument is. But the truth is, it's really the responsibility of the person giving an argument to be clear enough that the listener can identify what the conclusion is and what the premises are. And so for the most part in this class, we will pre-package arguments for you. We will tell you what the premises are, what the conclusion is. Now, with our focus on arguments, here's the basic place that every one of us sits in life. We do two things with arguments. On the one hand, we give arguments. Every one of us, on the one hand, in order to try to convince other people, but the truth is also even to try to convince ourselves. So you might think ideally, in one sense or other, all the time you're giving yourself arguments. You are deciding whether to believe something, whether to act on something, and you're evaluating the evidence you have for that. So, one of the most important skills a human being can have, a rational human being, is the ability to produce good arguments. That's important for convincing other people. It's important just for guiding your own thoughts, for learning, for coming to true conclusions rather than false conclusions. Of course, the other skill we must have in order to do well in life in terms of arguments is we must know when to accept somebody else's arguments. So if somebody else gives us an argument, we need to have the skill to say that's a good argument or it's not. So in some ultimate sense, the ultimate goal of this course, although there will be moments of this course where you think, I'm not sure how this helps me to the ultimate goal, leave that to us, your instructors. We think we're guiding you towards this ultimate goal. But first and foremost, the top row here in the slide, we want you to become better at producing good arguments. Now, the truth is, you're a student at Princeton University, you're probably pretty good already at giving good arguments, but all of us can become better. We can become faster, we can become more confident, our arguments can become more sophisticated, and they can become more clear. Secondly, we want you to become better at judging whether arguments are good. The rest of your life, you will spend evaluating arguments and deciding whether to accept their conclusions and whether to act upon them. We want you to make those judgments accurately, confidently, efficiently. And that's the second main aim we have this course. And now a third aim that's related to these first two, but is subtly different. That is, we want you not just to have the ability to see when an argument is bad, that is when it's not a convincing argument, but to have the ability to see why an argument is bad, thereby to assure yourself you're not reacting subjectively, but you're reacting for good reasons when you say the argument's bad. And secondly, so that you can convince other people not to accept the argument. It's one of the most important skills that you might think that's a very negative thing, but it's an important thing when there's lots of misinformation, lots of people trying to abuse other people's gullibility, for you to be able to say, that argument was not good. Let me explain to you why that argument's not good. So in the ultimate sense, these are the three goals of this course. So starting today, what I've been talking about good arguments and bad arguments. So what in the world are we talking about? Because the truth is, those words, good, bad, are actually not words one normally expects to hear in a scientifically oriented course. And let me try to assure you, this course is not intended to be a course of trading opinions. So this course, our final goal in this course, is to get some more objective knowledge and an objective ability to assess which arguments are objectively good and objectively bad. So that's what I'm claiming, is there is such a thing as objective goodness and objective badness. So what this means is, when I say good argument in this class, I don't mean, well, it seems good to me, it seems convincing to me, or we took a survey and most well-educated people think these are good arguments. Actually, for this class, our method is not very empirical in that sense at all. So it is true in one sense that I am pretending that I have access to the Platonic ideal of what a good argument is, but in truth, it's a community consensus of experts who've thought long and hard about these things. So let me come now to the objective notion of goodness. So what do we mean when we say that an argument is good? In other words, that it's strong in an objective sense. Now, let me quickly make a distinction, because that will allow us to focus our attention. So the distinction that I want to make here is between arguments that really are just intended to persuade more in favor of the conclusion, but not in any sort of necessarily decisive way. Those kinds of arguments in general. So the most general kind of argument is what we call an abductive argument. Now, more particularly, an abductive argument by definition is an argument where, in some sense, the conclusion goes beyond what the premises say. So I'll give you a typical example of that. Suppose that I were looking at ravens and I had boxes, a raven in each box, 100 boxes, and suppose that I look at the first 80 boxes and every raven in the first 80 boxes is black. Now, I might think I don't even need to look in the subsequent boxes because I am confident now that subsequent ravens that I see will be black. Now, so I might try to put forward an argument. The first raven was black. The second raven was black. The third raven was black. ... The 80th raven was black. And then conclusion, therefore, all ravens or all ravens in this collection are black. That is not necessarily a bad argument, but it is an abductive argument. The conclusion does not follow logically from the premises. It's supported by the premises possibly, but the premises don't prove the conclusion because the conclusion could still be false. It could be that the next raven is an albino raven, for example. Okay, so the focus of this course, because in a way, in one sense, our aspirations in this course are very high. We want to get clear on the notion of a good argument. On the other hand, we need to be modest. We need to restrict our focus. We're going to focus on the deductive arguments. The deductive arguments are the extreme case of the best, absolute strongest connection between premises and conclusion. In a deductive argument, the premises are intended to prove. Other words we might use here are entail or imply or logically necessitate the conclusion. Okay, a flawless deductive argument, one that does that perfectly and the evidence, the premises are true, is said to be sound. That's a code word. That's a technical word. So now we've crossed over. Good and bad are words that every human being uses, every English-speaking human being. They're a bit vague. Now we're coming to a technical sense of goodness. For deductive arguments, the technical sense of goodness that we'll employ is soundness, a sound argument. So let me clarify a little bit more about what that means. So what does it mean for an argument to be sound? Well, first of all, I'll just repeat what I said in the previous slide. Its premises logically imply or entail its conclusion. So another way of putting that, the second point here is you could say, well, the truth of its premises, the fact that its premises are true, establishes the truth of its conclusion. So the conclusion is true because the premises were true. And the key word there is that because. It's not just the conclusion is true and the premises are true. The conclusion is true because the premises are true. So somehow the argument has a form where the truth of the premises are what guarantees the truth of the conclusion. So let's try to boil that down into two separate parts. And this will be this analysis into two separate parts of being sound is the absolute key to making logic into something scientific, something objective, something we can all agree upon. So let's separate the question of, are the premises true? That's one question. The second question is the form of the argument valid? That is, if the premises were true, then the conclusion would be true. So here I'm saying if an argument's form is valid, that has this feature that if the premises were true, if premises true, then conclusion's true. But just being valid doesn't tell you that the premises are true. So the second ingredient of soundness is true premises. If you put those two together, valid form, true premises, then the conclusion will be true. That's a sound argument. Okay. Now, the nice thing we can do next to start making progress is we can bracket off the question of truth or falsity of premises. Any premise you look at, almost any premise you look at, you can find people that disagree about it. Take as a premise, God exists. Some people would say true, some people would say false. Take the premise that we should try to elect a Democratic president. Some people may say true, some people may say false. It can go on and on. Truth and falsity, except for very mundane things like what day of the week is it, they get controversial very quickly. So we're going to leave aside the question of truth and falsity of premises. We're going to focus exclusively from here on the question of, is an argument's form valid? Does it have that magic ingredient such that if the premises were true, then the conclusion would be true? What we want to understand is that thing, that structure of an argument that guarantees the truth of the premises would make the conclusion true, that the form of an argument being valid. But what is the form of an argument? So the claim that I'll make next, in line with what logicians have been saying for, in the Western tradition, thousands of years, is that whether or not an argument is valid or not depends only on its form. Its content is irrelevant. So whether the claims it makes are true or false has nothing to do with whether the argument form is valid. So content goes with the true premises side of the distinction between, or the analysis of sound into true premises and valid form. We're going to just look at the valid form bit. That has to do with form alone, not the content. So what is that thing, form? As you might guess, this is why logic, as we do it, is going to become symbolic. Because the thing is, we want to take an argument. Almost always, we represent arguments to ourselves in natural language. As I said before, premises, they're statements. Conclusion, it's a statement. These are all sentences in one's natural language. So where's the form? We need to find the form. That requires creative work. It requires, first of all, seeing when two arguments have the same form. And second of all, it's very convenient when you find that two arguments have the same form, it's very convenient to be able to display that form in some way. So think of the case of, think of architecture, but in reverse. So imagine that you have two houses, and suppose that those were built based on the same architectural plan. Now, if we didn't know about architectural plans, we may be able to say those two houses have the same form, but wouldn't it be nice if you could say their form is, and then pull out the sheet of paper that has the plan? So the next thing we want to do is we want to say, how can we take an argument in natural language? How can we get rid of all the content and represent its form alone to ourselves? If we can do that, which of course we can, that's what's coming, then we can start to see more and more clearly, what does it take for an argument to be valid? So let's just start right into that. Today what we'll do is I'll just give you a few examples of arguments and their forms, and we'll talk a little bit about why, cases where these arguments turn out to be valid because of their form, and cases where they don't. But actually, in truth, the arguments we'll look at for the next few minutes today, these arguments are actually more complicated than they seem, and in truth, we won't really uncover their form at a deep level until several weeks into the semester. So in the next session, we'll look at even simpler arguments and start extracting their form. But for now, let's just look at these examples here. So let's look at the argument first on the left on this slide. So it says, this is a variant of a very famous argument, brushed up for modern times. So all people are mortal. And again, we're not asking whether it's true or false. This is just an argument. All people are mortal. Beyonce is mortal, but sorry, Beyonce is a person, therefore Beyonce is mortal. And now pause for a minute, ask yourself, do you think this is a valid argument? Now, this does require a little bit of mental practice because we're used to in everyday life, we're used to thinking very concretely, right? We're used to thinking, do I accept the premises? Do I accept the conclusion? If you already accept them, you won't even think twice usually about whether the argument is valid. So I think what I want you to do here is I want you to think your hardest. Would the truth of the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion? So if those premises were true, would the conclusion be true? And the question is, it can't depend on the content of the premises. Okay, so let's look now at the right-hand side. So, and as you might guess, these are arguments that have a similar form. In fact, in some sense, the same form. The first premise is all Princeton alumni are rich. Second premise is Bezos is a Princeton alumnus. And conclusion is therefore Bezos is rich. And you might immediately, one of the problems we might have is we might read this and immediately when we get to the first sentence, we think, I don't accept this argument because the premise is not true because some Princeton alumni become professors, right? So they're not rich. Okay, so the premise isn't true, so who cares? But the question is, if it were true that all Princeton alumni were rich, and if it were true that Bezos were a Princeton alumnus, that is true actually, would it follow? That's the question. We don't care whether the conclusion is true or false. We care whether, were the premises true, would the conclusion be true? And that is the case here. So let's very quickly look at this and try to ignore the content and try to distill the form away from the content in this argument, in these two arguments. So all people are mortal on the left-hand side. All Princeton alumni are rich on the right-hand side. What's happening? We're saying all something or others are something else. So it's like this, all box people are mortal, circle. All Princeton alumni, box, are rich, circle. Notice the two sentences, the two premises from those two arguments, if you just ignore what's inside the box, ignore what's inside the circle, they're the same form, all, box, are, circle. Okay, the next sentences, the next premises in both arguments. So here, notice now, slightly tricky, right, that in English, we say all people, but we say every person. But these are really the same concept, right? So what's happening here is in the second premise, we're saying Beyonce is people, right? So in other words, Beyonce is a person. In the first thing, we said all people are mortal. So we say Beyonce is a person. So this is like a box again. Same thing with the argument on the right. Bezos is a Princeton alumnus. So that's like our box. And then let's write a diamond sort of shape for the name that occurs in these two things. Okay, and then finally, we come to the conclusion of the two arguments, and we have, therefore, Beyonce is mortal, so it's like diamond is circle, and the same one over here, Bezos is rich. Diamond is circle. And now, if you can step back for a minute and just sort of close your eyes a little bit and make them blurry so you ignore the letters in these things, and you just look at the form, the structure, the blueprint on which the two arguments are built, and they're the same. They have the same blueprint, and they're both valid arguments. The argument on the left is sound. The argument on the right is not sound, even though it has a true conclusion. The problem is its first premise is not true, so it's not sound. Okay, so there we start to get a sense of form, sameness of form. These two arguments have the same form. What that means is if the one is valid, the other is valid too. It also means if you can find any argument of this form, if you have a form and you can find any argument of that form with true premises and a false conclusion, no argument with that form is valid because Two arguments with the same form either are both valid or neither are valid. Validity depends only on form. In this case, on this slide, both are valid. Okay, you'll never find an argument with this form, I claim, where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. It's impossible because it's a valid form. Okay, here's another little example. All whales are mammals. Every mammal has a heart. Therefore, every whale has a heart. Perfectly valid, in fact, sound. What is its form? Well, let's actually slightly change our strategy from last time. So I drew some boxes and circles. Let's actually put in some letters instead here. So let's say like W, all W are M, all M again occurs here, are H, and then finally all W are H. In this case, we say has a heart instead of is a heart creature or something like that. So the grammar is a little bit complicated, but the fact is the general form is all W are M, all M are H, therefore all W are H. That always will work. No matter what you plug in for W and H, it doesn't matter. That form is valid. So look at the right, it's the same form. Notice I used W on the left for whales. Nobody made me do that. It was just the first letter that came to mind. I could use the same letter over here for lizards. I could say it doesn't matter. We could call them W. We could call mammals again by M. And here's again heart. But then the conclusion of this argument on the right is also again, every W is an H. So the thing on the right is also valid. These are two valid arguments. The thing on the right, the argument on the right is not sound. Once again, because the first premise is false. So it's not sound. Okay, so that wasn't too exciting because those arguments that we looked at, those pairs of arguments, both had valid forms. Where it starts to get a little bit more fun is the fact that you can show that an argument's form is not valid by finding an argument with the same form that has obviously true premises and a false conclusion. So consider the argument at the top here. Some philosophy concentrators are in this class. I believe that's true. Usually happens in a logic class. Some philosophy concentrators take it. Some people in this class are female. Now, if I could see the audience, I might know that's true. I suspect it's true. Therefore, some philosophy concentrators are female. Would that follow from the premises? So that actually is also true. Some philosophy concentrators are female, but that's not the question at hand. The question at hand is, would the truth of the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion? So would it follow from the first two premises that the conclusion is true? And there the answer is no, if you think about it, right? The fact that some philosophy concentrators are in this class and the fact that some people in this class are female would not entail that some philosophy concentrators are female. Because actually, look at the next argument, the argument below it, and that argument has exactly the same form. Some philosophy concentrators are in this class, same premise. Now just change female to physics concentrators. So now our second premise is some people in this class are physics concentrators, and let's just take for granted that's true. Would it follow from those two premises that some philosophy concentrators are physics concentrators? No. At Princeton, that's impossible, right? One concentration at Princeton. The premises are plausibly true. Of this second argument, the conclusion is false. Its form can't be valid. And in fact, if you look at it, how does it go in general? It goes some A are B, then it says some B, so that's B in this class, people in this class. You see B occurs again, some B are C, it's a new group of people. So philosophy concentrators are A's, in this class are B's, physics concentrators are C's, therefore some A's are C's. Doesn't follow, and actually you may have seen this in some other setting. People often draw Venn diagrams for this kind of argument to show that the argument is not valid, and it looks like this in this case, right? If you have A's and B's and C's, you could have the following kind of scenario, right? You could have some A's are B's, that is something falls in there, and you could have some B's are C's, but it wouldn't follow that A and B overlap. Okay, so that's just not a valid argument form. Okay, now, at this stage, it might seem very difficult in general to imagine all possible valid argument forms. How would one do that? So far, we've just done a very random look at a few arguments, try to pull out their form, check if that form is valid. How would one go on a systematic search? Because that is actually what we want in this class. In this class, we don't just want to become logic hobbyists. We don't want to just sort of learn to do a little bit of good thinking here and there. We want to be quite systematic in understanding the full range of good logical thinking. And so how do we figure this out? How do we figure out the valid argument forms? Now, let me say something a bit exaggerated, but actually true, is in this class, we're going to tell you all the valid argument forms, full stop, period. So in one sense, to be a bit audacious, it's the full range of human rationality we'll be describing for you, the full range of human deductive reasoning, what counts as valid reasoning. How do we do that? Now, there are two methods in general you might think of using to attack this problem. And that is, you might think of a top-down approach. And that would require some great genius, of course, who had some insight into the very nature of what validity means. And so there you'd think, aha, the person's just going to tell me an argument is valid if it has such and such feature, and then I'll always be able to go around and check that. Now, in some sense, I already hinted at a definition of that form. I said an argument is valid, or an argument form is valid, if whenever the premises were true, the conclusion would be true. And that's a perfectly reasonable definition. The only problem is you won't necessarily know, looking at a random argument pulled off the shelf, if that criterion applies to it. So another strategy one might use to try to figure out what all the valid argument forms are is a bottom-up approach. And that approach, you just start collecting. You start looking, inspecting various arguments, and determining whether they're valid or invalid. How do you do that? Well, the same way every human being has ever done in history, that is, they use their logically refined intuition. So I won't go into further at the moment into the philosophy of that, why it works, what's the explanation for that. It just does. We have consensus, we reach consensus when we look at these things closely. So that in one sense, what will happen in this class is it will be a little bit more of the second method, because what I will do starting in a couple lectures from now is I will start telling you some of the basic valid argument forms. And then we'll see that we have enough basic valid argument forms to reconstruct others where we have the intuition that they're valid. And then we can raise tough questions about how could we check that we have ability to reconstruct any valid argument form. So the question of the completeness of our rules of logic. Okay, so let me end here for now by giving you a quick preview of what will come in the next session and in the next couple sessions after that. So give you a sense of our trajectory, and in particular, how we will get closer to the goal announced at the beginning of this session, namely the goal of figuring out how we can produce good arguments better, more reliably, how we can judge whether arguments are valid or invalid, and finally, how we can convince other people or ourselves that they are not valid if they are not. We'll start with the next session by learning how to identify the form, in particular what we will call the propositional form of sentences in natural language, the natural language we're using being English, of course. We'll learn how to look at sentences, find the form, and represent that. We'll do that in the next session. Then what we'll do is we'll start by identifying some of the most basic and simple and agreed upon valid forms. For example, very famously one called modus ponens. So we'll start laying out those basic forms, and then third step here, you'll start to learn how to chain those forms together to form longer valid argument forms, and that will keep us occupied for a few weeks from now. So that's it for today. Next session, we'll start with representing the propositional form of sentences.